Okay, we are in Exodus 34 again, and we're going to look at start with verses 9 through 11. This is following this is Moses' reaction really to God's revelation, God's self-identification, and we're going to look at kind of uh, get into kind of a new covenant, if you will. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but this is Moses has already bowed low after God has announced himself, and now Moses is going to be praying, and this is the response from Moses. So, verses 9 through 11, he said, If now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, I pray, let the Lord go along in our midst, even though the people are so obstinate, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us as your own possession. Then God said, Behold, I am going to make a covenant before all your people. I will perform miracles which have not been produced in all the earth, nor among any of the nations. And all the people among you whom you live will see the working of the Lord, for it is a fearful thing that I am going to perform with you. Be sure to observe what I am commanding you this day. Behold, I am going to drive out the Amorite before you, and the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Okay. I'm starting to think now maybe we looked at this last week, but I didn't have the video to go by, so I couldn't remember. Anyway, why don't we let's go start with it anyway, and let's what any thoughts on those verses again? If not, don't worry about it. Okay, I think we talked about the demonstration of God's greatness being done through Israel to the surrounding nations. Um, One thing I don't remember us talking about though was that this idea of God saying, "I'm going to make a covenant." Um, what follows is kind of, in a sense, a new or a similar thing to the Ten Commandments. Um, it's a Decalogue or whatever they call it. 10 words. Um, those words are not the same as the Ten Commandments we see in Exodus chapter 20. Excuse me, but uh, so you can understand maybe the upcoming covenant as a new covenant, something completely different, a refinement of the first 10 commandments, or in addition to the first 10 commandments, however you want to look at it. I think they certainly seem relevant compared to or in light of what Israel has done while Moses was away, in light of the idolatry of Israel. God comes back and kind of, instead of just saying 4 commandments really about their relationship with him, going into greater detail, making greater demands, greater requirements of more specific, I guess I should say, requirements of Israel regarding their worship life, regarding their relationship with God. And what God is doing for Israel in front of these other people should inspire their loyalty to him. That's the upshot of it. It doesn't always, but it should. But it gives them also hope to return to it. So, but as we saw in what Moses has to say, there is this component. Well, I think we talked about this last week of ongoing, kind of perpetual forgiveness in the relationship between God and Israel. That God will need to be an ongoingly forgiving God. That if He's not forgiving them, and as the relationship plays out, as it develops, then it won't work because He can't just set up the requirements and expect them to keep them, and therefore avoid any conflict with God. They are going to sin. They are going to break the covenant. They are going to do things they're not supposed to do. They can only stay in covenant with God if He forgives them for those sins. And I think that's a good excuse me, way of looking at our relationship with God. We are forgiven when we enter into the waters of baptism and rise up out of it. God forgives us of our sins, but it's not like we go out. We are new creatures, but it's not like we go out and live totally sinless lives after that. That just doesn't happen. We are transformed. We are new creatures, but we have all of the same old weaknesses, don't we? And some of the same sins easily entangle us, and we need to be forgiven for those, or we won't be in relationship with God. So it is kind of again a preview of the new covenant that will come through Christ, and this, in a sense, recognizes, even if it's not really a truly new covenant, it tells us that God's relationship with Israel uh, is not the final word. That the Ten Commandments are not God's final word, even on those subjects. That He's got more to say about them, and that ultimately the final word from God is the word that becomes flesh. That's Christ is the final word, and that's what we have to look forward to, and that's kind of how we understand all of these other things. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay. Sorry. Should have taken the microphone away. Well, I'm getting choked up. But verses 12 through 28. So a pretty long reading here, so bear with me. Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, or it will become a snare in your midst. But rather you are to tear down their altars, and smash their sacred pillars, and cut down their asherim. For you shall not worship any other God, for the Lord God, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Otherwise, you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice. And you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods, and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods. You shall make for yourself no molten gods. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days you are to eat unleavened bread as I commanded you, and at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in the month of Abib you came out of Egypt. The first offspring from every womb belongs to me, and all your male livestock, the first offspring from cattle and sheep. You shall redeem a lamb, the first offspring from a donkey, and if you do not redeem it, you shall break its neck. You shall redeem all the firstborn of your sons. None shall appear before me empty handed. You shall work 6 days, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during plowing time and harvest you shall rest. For you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks, that is the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the turn of the year. 3 times a year all your males are to appear before the Lord God, the God of Israel. For I will drive out the nations before you, and enlarge your borders, and no man shall covet your land when you go up 3 times a year to appear before the Lord your God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor is the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover to be left over until morning. You shall bring the very first of the first fruits of your soil into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Then the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread or drink water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. Okay. What do we think about that? I am sorry to y'all for this onset of something or other, and I'm really sorry for the folks hearing it through the microphone. So, They didn't have to. They had to redeem them. They would have had to make some other lesser animal sacrifice, depending on their. Yes, because if they didn't redeem it, then they had to kill it. Yes. Maybe they weren't able to, for some reason, at the time to redeem it. But you couldn't. That firstborn belongs to God. That's the message. You don't get to keep it unless you redeem it.
Tries to help them out by saying, get rid of all the foreign idols and when you capture the land, don't keep their stuff. They try to remove temptation from them, but they obviously don't listen.
Well, yeah, God has a plan, but God's plans usually involve some human interaction. I got to quit wearing that Chanel number 5. I think. God is going to drive their enemies out before them. But at the same time, that doesn't mean God is just going to make them miraculously disappear. They have to go to war. They have to fight. They're going to suffer casualties. They have to uh, utterly destroy their enemy, and that is really a hard requirement to wipe them completely out. And this is hard for contemporary readers of this text. Sometimes, basically, God is prescribing genocide, and of course, Israel's had its own experience with genocide and probably genocides, attempts to completely wipe them out. So um, it's a difficult passage on that front. The response or the result of failure to comply fully with these requirements is not that you won't get the land; it's that you will be ensnared by the people around you. And pretty quickly, Israel starts making covenants. Once they start the conquest, which is still a long ways off, and a different set of people, uh, but once they start making those conquests, they start making deals very quickly. Because God does these things, because God creates this great reputation that precedes Israel, the countries start sending out, the city states really start sending out emissaries saying, let's cut a deal, let's make a deal. And, all these are kind of Semitic people, and when it comes to making deals, they're usually open to that. And, there's that's maybe an anti-Semitic statement. I don't mean it as a negative way. It's just that was their culture, to make deals. And you see Abraham, we talked about that when he bought that piece of property. He didn't really want to not pay for it because then it's not really yours. If they just give it to you, you're occupying it by their pleasure, by their desire. And at the same time, the other people aren't saying, well, we can't just take Abraham at his word either. We can't trust Abraham. We need to make it kind of a formal legal deal by the standards of that day. So there is an exchange, payment, and all of that. So it's supposedly legally Abraham's. And that's, of course, what Israel calls back. They bring it up in the story of their people taking the land. Our father paid for this, so this is our land. Um, um, so it's you see a lot of the nature of the peoples of the time, and diplomacy is always something that should be sought. It's not like if it looks like war is inevitable, you should shut down diplomatic communications. There's a lot of people who look back on history, and a guy named Neville Chamberlain. Has anyone ever heard of Neville Chamberlain? The Prime Minister of England before, I guess, Churchill or whatever. He tried to appease Hitler, tried to make a deal with Hitler, and he gets castigated historically. He is he's portrayed as an absolute moron in the annals of history, I guess you could say. But if you look at how awful World War II was, how utterly terrible it was, particularly in Europe. We have a different view of it, I think, because it wasn't very much, other than Pearl Harbor, it wasn't really visited to our shores very much. There were a couple of other incidents, but look at the big deal we make about Pearl Harbor, though. I mean, that's every year, a big deal. It is a date that will live in infamy. I mean, we will, remember that. It's 80 years in a couple years. It'll be, I guess it was 80 years already. So
And you go over there and you could walk right out and see that ship down there.
you can see a little oil slick. Yeah.
And there's a big number of men still down on
Yes.
their grave.
Yes.
So there's nothing.
No. And that's one day in a war for us that lasted 4 years. It lasted more like 6 or 7 for Europe, and just devastated countries. And some of that devastation is just really now becoming problematic in a way. A lot of those countries in Europe, their populations are on a steep decline. They lost a whole generation of fathers and mothers, and not just men, soldiers. They lost civilians too. And we didn't bomb with smart bombs in 1943 or 1944 or 1940. We bombed carpet bombing, basically. We dropped a whole bunch of bombs. We bombed this German city of Dresden, which had no military significance whatsoever. It was a mistake, I guess. I don't know what happened. Oops. Sorry. But it was a German city, so they were the enemy, I guess. But that's, it was a big deal. It's a big deal to have that devastation. So I think when you look at Chamberlain, you might cut him a little bit of slack. He was trying to avoid. Maybe he saw this is what's going to happen if we go to war. And the Holocaust, as we know it, wasn't as well known, at least at the time. There was persecution. They knew the Jews were being persecuted. They're always persecuted. So a guy trying to avoid World War II, you might have to make some concessions. Diplomacy is not always. The problem here is Israel's told not to negotiate, not to make a covenant. And that becomes the problem when they actually do it, and they are ensnared. And they are ensnared by the idolatry of the nations they were supposed to have completely eliminated. So, there is this idea, and I think, that it's kind of this aspiration in our relationship with God to ultimately, totally drive the enemy out of our lives, to completely eliminate sin as the enemy. And that's a great aspiration, and it's one no one ever gets to. But if that's your aspiration, perhaps you'll be more successful than you would be any other way. If you shoot for perfection, which is unattainable, you might achieve excellence along the way. I think that's a Vince Lombardi quote. And that was what God called them to do. And I think that really the hinge point of this passage is verse 14, where God says, I am jealous. My name is jealous. He just announced his name to Moses, and there was no mention of jealousy. There is a mention of jealousy back in the Exodus chapter 20, isn't there? The Lord your God is a jealous God. Here he says, my name is jealousy. We're not supposed to be jealous. Well, God's jealous, right? It's a different kind of jealousy, isn't it? I mean, look what I have done for you. Look what I am doing for you. How can you play the harlot, basically, with these other gods? And that playing the harlot is kind of a spiritual metaphor, that worshiping idols is a form of spiritual adultery with God. It's also, based on those ancient religions, an actual, not a metaphor. a literal statement. And they had prostitution within male and female, within their context of their religion. And we might think that could never happen in America, and never happen today. I'm not going to name any specific groups, but there's been some interesting church services of one sort or another the last few years in America, in groups that profess to be Christians. They have certainly pushed the boundaries of what we normally do in a worship service. So not just us, not just little old us, but what anybody that I had heard of ever doing. It's kind of gone out the, I guess, stained glass window. But it's interesting that this jealousy, God says, my name is jealousy. So this is also a very key component to his nature, to God's nature, is that he demands absolute loyalty, fidelity from his people. And he will not share us. And I know, again, a lot of folks in the churches of Christ, a lot of people would never in a million years think that they worship idols. But they really like that big brand new lake house they just bought. Or they really like their employer that pays them a big fat paycheck that they earn, rendering service as to the Lord, perhaps. Okay. We just have to really be careful that the things that God gives us as a blessing, we continually give thanks to God for those things, rather than thanking some billionaire who's out on a super yacht and doesn't even know who you are right now. And there's nothing wrong inherently, I guess, with being a billionaire that owns a super yacht. I might want to try it sometime. I don't know. But maybe I would not handle that too well. I don't know. Maybe the Lord is shielding me from that snare. I don't know. But
anytime you place something in front of God or above God, isn't that basically idolatry?
well, it's not. I would say it doesn't have to be what we normally or historically have thought of as an idol. It doesn't have to have the name Baal attached to it. It doesn't have to have some, what everyone recognizes as a distinct religious component to it. But again, I just brought you this example before. For a couple of seasons, I worked at a golf course in Auburn, and a lot of those big companies in the Seattle area would rent the course for the day and have a big. They weren't really playing golf out there. They were inebriatedly driving golf carts around the golf course for the most part. If the local authorities needed to stack up their DWI quota, just park outside of that course and get them when they leave, because they are, most of them, lit. But I didn't really fully comprehend that when I hired on. I soon found out that's how that course made its money. But those people would frequently just express just how awesome their employer was. They would say that, oh, our company is so great. The president of our company, he's treating us so well. And they were driving round trip, probably 2 hours a day in the commute. And they were expected really to work 14, 16, 18 hours. They'd have we have daycare on site. Yeah. So you could be there even more. They want you to live. We got a gym. Yeah. They want you to do everything. They'll put a cot in your cubicle if you want them to, if you'll stay there and work. God in this format says you're going to rest, right? He puts work in a different priority. Work is not your God. Rest. God is the God of rest. If they wanted to work every day, they could stay in Egypt. Work is the curse. By the sweat of your brow is part of the curse. It's not part of the prescription for a godly life. It's part of God cursing humanity. Our God is a God of rest, a God who rested. And he calls upon Israel to do the same. And then there's a lot of other requirements or provisions that respond to proper worship, proper relationship with God, keeping the festivals, keeping the feasts, redeeming firstborn of all species from human to the livestock. So the male firstborn. So it would be, all of this kind of, we talked about this, it's been a while, but all of this reflects Israel's trust in God. Yes, ma'am.
And that I find very interesting. They were mandated to give to God the firstborn. And today, we're not mandated to do it. We have to figure all this out for ourselves. It seems like we're much better off than the Israelites.
It's a different relationship for sure, and it is better. I think that's much of the thrust of the book of Hebrews is the superiority of the new covenant in Christ to the old covenant in Moses. But the firstborn was given, though, wasn't he? And Jesus is the only begotten, the firstborn, the first fruit. God gave the firstborn to redeem us.
But I didn't have to redeem my son.
You would have liked to, but it was, or just given him, or sometimes wring his neck, whatever, But that's the way that goes.
Gave them to the Lord. What did they do?
Well,
Go live in the temple.
well, that's what Samuel does, isn't
I
it?
know that.
Yeah.
Not all of them.
They would make a sacrifice, a redeeming sacrifice, probably a lamb, and then I think if it was poor people, they would do the turtle dove thing, the pigeon. You may think, like me, that pigeons are dirty little animals and you never want to be around them, but they are actually clean under the Mosaic covenant, and they are eaten all over the world. They are. And when you grew up eating, your folks might have gone dove hunting, and the dove or pigeon. What's that?
We had a hutch,
Pigeon hutch. Okay.
just like we had a rabbit hutch here. And chickens out there.
Rabbits weren't clean. Oh, sorry.
Oh, we ate them.
They weren't clean under the Mosaic law, but that's okay. So they've got claws. They don't have cloven hoof. So squirrels are not rodents, but were not clean either. No. But and we'll look at this here in just a second. A particular interesting dietary thing in here, but the practice of keeping the Sabbath, the practice of going to the festivals, of leaving your home and traveling to Jerusalem to observe Passover, Feast of Weeks, etc. Don't you kind of worry whenever you travel now? You leave your house, you kind of are a little bit worried about it. Well, this was before they had cameras on the doorbells. This is a long time. You leave, you think, well, somebody's going to take it. Well, if you trust God, you believe that it will be there when you get back. If you trust God, you take the Sabbath off in planting and in harvest. I mean, we've got a lot of wheat farmers around here. I bet a bunch of them work 7 days a week when they were cutting wheat. If it was the right day to cut, if the wheat was nice and dry, they were out there cutting. But then God didn't make the offer to them, did he? That's been kind of my response to the big group in our area that tries to somewhat keep the Mosaic laws. God is making this offer to Israel. He's not making it to anyone else. And it reflects Israel's relationship with God. That when work is the most advisory thing to do, advisable thing to do, you don't do it. And this is really going to cause problem when Israel goes off into Babylonian captivity. And it's time to harvest in Babylon. And the Babylonians are saying, get out there and work. And they're saying, it's Sabbath. We're not going to. So, it's a defining characteristic of who Israel is, that they do not work on the Sabbath. And it shows their relationship and their trust in God, that even when they keep these provisions, which can be demanding at times, But when they keep those provisions in God, God takes care of them. Even when you don't go back and make a second cutting harvest of your crop, and you let the poor people glean, you're going to have enough. And now they have enough. And there are so many commandments about Moses in the law of Moses that reflect God's concern for people that don't have very much. They say, well, they didn't have welfare back then. Yeah, they did. And God looked after the poor people. At least He intended to. And when it doesn't happen, then you don't oppress or you don't protect the widow, the orphan, the alien. You oppress them instead. God's not happy with them. So they're supposed to be taken care of and still have enough. I think it's interesting the dietary restriction: do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Have y'all ever done that? Boiled a goat in its mother's milk? Nobody here has done that. Has anyone here ever had a cheeseburger? You don't put. You're keeping kosher then, aren't you? McDonald's used to sell. They would have. When I worked there, we'd have a whole row of quarter pounders with cheese lined up to hand out, sell, whatever, and we'd have like 2 quarter pounders without cheese. Because eating meat and dairy together would violate this law under the Jewish interpretation of it. And if you ever have a chance to go into someone who is a strictly observant Jewish person's home, if they'll let the filthy Gentile in there, I guess, they'll have 2 kitchens. If they have the means, they will have 2 kitchens. The meat and dairy are not kept in the same kitchen. They can eat meat. You can have dairy. You can have meat. You can't have them together. Now, I think the specific provision is linked to some ancient fertility rituals of pagan cultures. This was like something they would do to have better crops, have more kids, whatever. Fertility to the ancient world was kind of all that. Having kids, having good crops, having your livestock do well, all that. That's all fertility. So you're lumping your wife in with your breeding cows, but that's a whole different. That's their problem, not ours, is it? But that's evidently when you see those little odd provisions sometimes in the law, they may be. It doesn't really fit in with. It doesn't seem to fit in with what's going on around it. This makes sense in the context of maybe an idolatrous practice, something they would do before a false god. The people in the area would do it before a false god to elicit greater fertility from their toils. So I think that's what's going on there. Any other thoughts on this passage? Okay, well, that's about a minute early, but I think I'm going to let y'all out, and we will finish up the chapter next week, and then we will get in. We're just going to, again, your homework assignment is to read chapters 35 through 40 on your own if you want to read them. And if something jumps out that you want to talk about, bring that up. I'll have a few verses that we'll talk about as well. And we'll do it for as long as y'all want to do it. There's no big hurry. I don't want to cut anybody off. I also don't want to fight through this material verse by verse because it's so similar to something we've already fought through. So, okay.
And you can answer this when we get to it, but is there, I guess the question is, what is the purpose of the repetition, so much repetition of this stuff?
Well, he commanded them to do it, and then the last several chapters of Exodus, they're actually doing it. It's the execution of what was commanded for them to do. So that's why they're very similar. If you look at most commentaries, they will not pound verse through or both kind. When they get to this last one, they'll refer you back to the ones they've already talked about. So, Okay. Thank you for your attention and comments. And Mr. Kelso, will